So the title is a bit, Tina said, give me a sexy title. So I was like, okay, how many words can I fit into a title? But it's essentially around discussions around how we use technology in our teaching, because of course, as we'll discuss, there's just this assumption or almost de facto status that we're in now that using technology in teaching is what we're meant to do. And I hope to show you that that has advantages, but nevertheless, some lessons from my own experiences maybe I want to share with you in terms of trying to emphasize what aspects or what considerations should be made in terms of thinking about technology in teaching. So what I hope to do, because I can waffle for quite a lot, is to talk for about 30 minutes or so, actually, 35 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. I think that'll be a lot more useful than me talking for 59 minutes and then everybody running off to where they're meant to be next. So I'll try and keep an eye on time, but feel free to wave me down if you're flagging after about 25 minutes. I should say in my head it's about 5 a.m. in the morning, so not quite sure what I'll say to you now. Okay, so the one thing I was warned about Melbourne is it's winter. It's winter in Australia, so wrap up warm, but just to compare and contrast. It's lovely here at the moment. I don't know what everybody's complaining about, but anyway. Okay, so depending on who you talk to, and we all have colleagues of various interests and so on, there are various reasons why we want to think about using technology. And I think the top one is almost pervasive. This assumption that this is something that we are meant to do. And I think there are, and I hope to show you good reasons why we should consider technology, but of course that isn't the reason why we should use technology, just because it's what it's done. So there's kind of this, and I'm sure you could think of many more, but there's kind of this spectrum of reasons why we want to incorporate technology into whatever aspect of teaching we happen to be doing. Ranging from technological reasons, here's this really cool thing that we can do now and it'll be flash bang whiz and everything will be amazing. I have a lot of early work on my laptop that's lots of flash bang whiz, it'll be amazing, that never really got used, never really saw the light of day, because of course it wasn't built into teaching. Right down to good pedagogical reasons why we might think about using technology. And a lot of what I've been thinking about, I'm now retrofitting my thoughts, because on the Guardian website, newspapers are really good, and publishing houses are a really great way to see what's going on in terms of new trends. And last year, I think the Guardian, a UK-based newspaper but has international sites, started this thing during the American election. Essentially, it was about simple facts, simple Q&As. This is in the whole, before when fake news was new and all this kind of thing. Just simple explainers for their readers around just very particular issues. So in the UK at the moment, the big issue is BBC are releasing the salary of their employers. So the Guardian would produce something like this, a little explainer, just kind of a brief summary if you were a busy person, you just wanted to go in and have a quick, and they'd have this thing, was it helpful or not? So this is essentially a little bit of information dissemination, but they're trying to garner some feedback. But yesterday I was on the Guardian website and they had this instead. So they had the usual article and then they had this little block, and it says need something explained, and there are 3 questions. So I'm a reader reading this and I'm thinking, oh, here's something I'm querying, this is something I'm interested in. So I click on something and I say ask, and when I click on ask, it says thank you, we have registered your vote, sign up and we will email you with an answer. Now of course, from a newspaper's point of view, this is fantastic because they get your email and all that kind of thing. But how powerful is this as a reader? Suddenly the Guardian, who is publishing to, it's one of the highest website hits in the world, suddenly me as an individual reader, the Guardian cares what I think about, and they're going to send me this content because it's based on what I've told them that I'm interested in. I think this is a really powerful message about personalisation and how we can use technology in a very simple way to personalise the experience for users. The Guardian could have just easily have put up, and it's interesting because this was yesterday and today when I went in, they had put this up, so they could have very easily just put up this information dissemination, which as a reader I wouldn't have engaged with as much because that was just part of the information on the page. Whereas suddenly now, because I'm clicking on this and saying, yes, I'm interested in this part, and then I get that information sent to me, suddenly this is a very personal experience. And this is something I've been thinking about over the last while, about how technology can be useful in terms of personalizing your experience, especially in an era where we're just cramming more and more people into our lecture halls. So personalization is something I've been thinking about in terms of an ongoing consideration about education as a dialogue. In other words, if we were to go to one extreme, Seery goes into his lectures, talks to a class for 15 minutes, sets that class an exam, and Seery finds out how good that class were. That was a very simple conversation. I told you something, then I asked you a question, you told me something back, and that was the end of the conversation. Whereas if we can move that to the other extreme, where we can have an ongoing conversation, and I should say this work has been very much influenced by my physics colleagues at Edinburgh. This idea of an ongoing conversation where I say something to you in a lecture, you say something back to me, maybe through clickers or some kind of interaction. Okay, we can't have people asking questions in 1,500 seat theatres, but clickers are a way of having this conversation. You're having a personal interaction with me, even though I'm not talking to you personally. I'm reflecting back to you, yes, the people who answered part C were wrong because this is why, the people who said D were right, I'm having a conversation, what these authors call a vicarious interaction. So this idea of personalization, I think, is very powerful. So that's one thing we can think about. Another thing is, something I'll talk about in a minute, is beginning the conversation before the lecture begins. So me presenting some information to you doing a quiz or having some form of feedback, and then me using the lecture time to say, okay, some people had this in the quiz, some people talked about this. I'm having a conversation with those groups of people. And then that can follow on from after tutorials. So this idea of a back and forward conversation, I think, is very powerful, and something that I will be honest to say, retrofitting a lot of my thoughts about, because it wasn't something that was there when I was designing it. But I think it explains quite a lot of the observations I'm seeing. Okay, so these are various things that I've been thinking about in terms of using technology, and the ones that are underlined, I'm just going to give you case studies. Now, I guess this is a very broad audience. I'm going to keep it pretty high level and just sort of illustrate generally with case studies, and then we'll hopefully use a discussion time to raise anything that's of interest. So I've taken one from each column. So the first one is this idea of preparing students for learning. This is one of the first studies I did several years ago, and it arose out of an issue that we had when I was teaching at the time, where half the students that we were teaching in our first year course hadn't done that subject before, and half had. So it was a very difficult class to teach because there was a very broad range of prior knowledge. And we were interested. We reassured students. We said, don't worry, we know some of you haven't done this before, we'll start from scratch. And we did a study to see if that was actually the case. And it was a bit disappointing, because as one of the lecturers in the course, of course, you want to make sure that everybody's learning well. But what we found was the students who hadn't done the subject before, in our case chemistry, their average score was much lower than the average score of people who had done chemistry before. This is quite worrying, because it meant then that we were inviting students onto our course, but yet the ability or the capacity of those students to do well in that course depended on their previous experience. One thing we did notice was the nightmare scenario would have been that difference would have been there in second year and in third year and in their final year. So what we found was that there was no correlation in subsequent years. It was just this first year. So that led me on to think about, well, what is the reason for this difference? And through other measures, we were able to say it wasn't just that better students did chemistry. It wasn't just that all the bright kids in the class had done chemistry at school, because they're obviously naturally more talented. Because there were other factors that showed that the capacity of students was uniform. It wasn't specifically to do with chemistry. So what we proposed, or what I kind of based the intervention on, was essentially that the students who had chemistry before weren't necessarily better students, but they had some capacity, they had some of the language involved in that discipline. And when you look at a first year lecture course, in the very first few weeks, students are bombarded with a lot of new language. So of course, depending on your discipline, that's going to vary. But in chemistry, we throw a lot of new language at students very quickly, and not only expecting to know what those words mean, but how they relate. So of course, students who had done chemistry before were much better able to cope with this new world effectively, because they had some of the language coming into it. So the approach then to try and solve this was grounded in cognitive load theory. And cognitive load theory describes our ability to process new information in terms of working memory, the working memory capacity. But the working memory capacity, as described by cognitive load theory, is a limited space and can fill up effectively due to various different types of load. One is intrinsic load. This is the difficulty of the material. So in other words, the more new terms there are, the more difficult the material is to process. That means we'll have a very high intrinsic load. So I was counting the new terms I was using in my chemistry lectures, and very often there were 20, 25 new words for students in their first and second lectures in university. So obviously this is imposing a very high load on students. The second type of load is extraneous load. How difficult is it to get the information from the learning materials? So if it's for novice learners, it differs for experts, but for novice learners, if it's difficult to get the information from learning materials, well then learners have to spend some mental effort on that, and that takes up some of their capacity to engage in what's called germane load, and this is effectively the processing of this information and incorporation of it into schema. So cognitive load theory really spoke to me at the time of this, and it's guided a lot of my work since, because it explained very nicely this idea of how do we present information to novice learners, how do we expect them to process that, what is their capacity for doing that. Cognitive load theory in terms of designing multimedia materials is framed by the multimedia theory of learning by Richard Mayer, who many of you may have come across. And Mayer essentially has devised several principles for designing e-resources. So we were going to present students with some intervention, some electronic resource that would help them navigate this new world that they were engaging in, help them try and bring down the intrinsic load of the material as we were presenting it. So Mayer has all these wonderful principles. I mean, some of them are very obvious. The things like the coherence principle, which effectively means don't have any extra blurb in there. Keep the facts, keep the information clean, keep it to what the students need to know. So all of these principles sort of spit out ways and ideas for how you should present electronic material. So for example, the contiguity principle effectively means that you can present information the information that you present can be split by space. In other words, so here is what seemingly is a very clear piece of information about a laboratory instruction. So this is where a student is given test tube and sends some text associated with that text tube. The split attention principle says that it is better to have the text associated with the diagram rather than have the text underneath the diagram. And in chemistry, there's a really lovely case of that being shown very clearly. So this is very powerful in terms of lab manual design. How do we present complex information to students? Or another aspect, and we're all guilty, well certainly I'm guilty of this in PowerPoint presentations, where we show a nice diagram on one slide, and then in the next slide we say, what you saw on the last slide was. So of course what the student has to do is oscillate between the two slides in their mind, or else you're oscillating between the two slides in their head. And from a cognitive load point of view, this causes extraneous load. So the argument is that you should have the diagram presented with some key text, and the rest of the text is presented verbally. So this is what may also be known as dual coding. Some of the information is being presented visually, some of the information is being presented verbally. So we were designing, or I was designing a resource to try and address this cognitive load issue, guided by some of these principles. And this has literally just been updated. I can send Tina the slides, but Mayer literally, this is published in July. They've added in a few more based on more recent research studies. Okay, so the intervention was very simple. What the hypothesis was that these students are only performing worse because they're not familiar with the terms as they're being introduced in the lecture. So students would have to watch some video, some activity, with an interactive activity, where the purpose of the activity was to introduce these key terms. It wasn't to go through the lecture, it wasn't to summarize the lecture, it was to introduce the key terms. And then at the end, the students would have to do a quiz, a very simple quiz, because it's on the words being introduced in the lecture, not on the chemical concepts. So there were different types of quizzes or whatever. So with my retrofitting personalisation hat on, what we can say is that the students, and this actually was borne out in research carried out by a colleague of mine who was also working on this, Claire McDonnell. Students said, we love getting the feedback scores because it gives us a sense of where we are. These are students in the very first few weeks of university. They all knew their place when, where their ranking was in their school, but now suddenly they're coming to a new environment and not quite clear where they fit. So they loved these easy quizzes because it gave them a sense of where they were in the process. Also, in these pre-lecture videos, there will usually be a sentence saying, this is something that was shown by this experiment. Before you come to the lecture, I want you to go and look up this experiment and make some notes about it, and we'll discuss that in class. So that's beginning to seed this dialogue, this idea of conversation before the students will come to class. Now, at the time, this was a class of about 100, 120 people, so it was just about possible to kind of say, okay, what did you think about that up there, and so on, and build up the idea of notes together. That obviously becomes more difficult with larger class sizes. Okay, so what happens? So these boxes here, the white boxes are the students that didn't have chemistry at school, the grey boxes are students that did. So we looked at all the years prior to the intervention, and there was always a significant difference, and then in the year after intervention, and indeed ever since until I left, that significant difference disappeared. So just simply by introducing these very simple pre-lecture activities, introducing the concepts and the words the students would have to use in advance of the lecture, completely removed this this difference between semester scores, between exam scores. The significance and the correlation disappeared. So that was way back in 2011, 2012, and of course since then flipped lectures became very popular. And flipped lectures are effectively based on the same principle, whereby we are introducing content, in this case a summary of the lecture content in advance of the lectures. And the jury's still out in flipped lectures about what they mean and how they work and so on. There isn't really a theoretical basis for flipped lectures yet, but for me it fits very nicely into the idea of cognitive load theory. We are introducing content in advance to students, we are enabling them time to have processed some of that content, and then the lecture is used to begin to dwell on that, tease out arguments and so on. So the literature has shown several examples of where there's increased scores, especially for students in what the Americans call DFWs, DEF and withdrawals. So we tend to see the lower end of the curve shifting up. So the people that did withdraw tend to stick with it and get a D. The people that were on the Ds tend to move up. The people in A and Bs tend not to change very much because the people in A and Bs will do well in whatever system you throw at them. So we see evidence for increased retention. From my own point of view, this is of interest because it's addressing the idea of universal design. In other words, there's more than one way to present an amount of information to students. We are now providing an alternative way. And in my own study, what we were interested in was, again, I didn't call it personalisation at the time, but this idea of getting a sense from students what they were having difficulty with in their own work. So in my own work, students would have to watch these pre-lecture videos, do a quiz beforehand. So I would get a sense in the quizzes what questions were difficult, but also the students were asked to say, what did you find most difficult this week? So before the lecture, I would trawl through some of these and come up with sort of some general things. And this was enormously powerful because you can now begin to get a sense of what kind of things people were having difficulty with. And as well as saying, okay, so some people said that this particular thing was difficult, so what we'll do now is we'll just go over that again with another example. So again, you're speaking back to, you're continuing this conversation. One thing I didn't get to move on to, what I wanted to was, there was a kind of three different levels of category in terms of how students were saying they had difficulties. So there was just, the first student was, this is just difficult, it's too much, I don't know what's going on. The second was, this is difficult, and when I look through it, this is the part I'm having trouble with. I don't know how you got from here to here. Ideal student, because this is the part where you can just dive in and say, this is what you do. And then the third part is even more ideal, but very rare, is this is difficult, but actually I went to the textbook and had a look. Apparently those students still exist. I don't know if you have them, but where this is moving to, when I finally get back to it, but a lot of other people are looking at this, is we can begin to become much more intelligent now about helping these students. So students are beginning to weave their own paths through content. So in other words, we can have some responsive resources or quizzes or information to students depending on what point they're identifying a difficulty. Okay, so that's the first kind of general example of using technology, but my intention here is to show you that the technology is sort of lurking in the background, hiding underneath what is essentially a pedagogic argument. Okay, the second thing is this idea of learning communities, which I think is something very powerful. When we have a group of chemists coming in to a university, they are identifying as chemists and they want to be chemists. They want to be seen as professional chemists. They want to work with other chemists. They want to talk about chemistry. So I'm very keen on this idea of learning communities, or just getting people together discussing chemistry. And discussion boards are a very useful way of doing this. Now, discussion boards have had a long and interesting history mostly because the discussion board interface has often been very poor. But MOOCs, for a variety of reasons, have really shown a resurgence in discussion boards because they provide a very useful way of dealing with a very large number of students very easily. So there's kind of a renewed interest in discussion boards. But in previous work I did with online students, so I'll be talking about in-class students in a moment, but with online students, I identified a kind of a grid of different types of students you get in discussion fora. So there's the people who either never log in or never engage whatsoever. So these are the little effort, low interaction people. Then you have the little effort, high interaction. Hi guys, that's really great, thanks for sharing that. Love that, see you on Friday for the pub, everything's great, love this world, everything's very positive, but not actually anything academic or intellectual. Then on the other side you have people who are not doing very much, there's not very much contribution, but boy are they checking in every day. What's the response to that? Is there something new here? They're constantly interacting, engaging. And these are the people we forget about, because a small proportion, I would say less than 10% in the class, will be the people who are asking questions, prompting. So in this particular case, students there were peer interactions, answering other questions and so on. These are the people who drive the discussion board forward, but these are the people, I think, who are the majority of discussion board users. So discussion boards have been problematic because the question we continually ask is, how do we get students to contribute? Students won't contribute to discussion boards. And what I've kind of come to realize or accept is that discussion boards are what people want discussion boards to be. In other words, if it is somebody who is checking in regularly and seeing if there's new answers but being far too shy to contribute, well then that is a useful contribution to that person. That person is feeling part of this community whereby we are presenting information and sharing information among each other. And I'll show you some evidence for that in a second. But this is something that we get back very strongly from students. Students who never contribute to a discussion board in terms of posting absolutely love it and talk about it and feel part of it because they got something useful from it. So it's not just about numbers of contributions. So some ways that you can use discussion boards are ongoing support. So for our lab program, we have a discussion board because the particular area of chemistry I teach is very mathematical. So students will do a lab and then they'll go away and then they'll come back to me in a week and say, I spent 15 hours writing that lab report. I should have taken them 2. So obviously something's gone wrong there. There was some mental disconnect that they weren't able to overcome, and it was usually something very simple. So almost at the last minute, most of my time this year has been spent on lab development, and almost at the last minute I just put into discussion boards to try and get over that. However, they could be used for things like flash revision. Okay, we're going to have a week after my course finishes, and if you have any questions you can discuss this or whatever.
Is it okay to ask questions?
Sure, yeah. I should say I'm a bit deaf, so I'll have to, yeah.
So my question is, because we engage in discussion groups, and the thing I found is, as the academic, once we respond, the conversation ends. So I was wondering what your experience is around that, and what you could offer for advice to how to manage that.
Yeah, so there's 2 things there. I've used discussion boards for different reasons. One of them is I want a peer interaction.
Yeah.
So very much I want students to post a question and I want other students to answer it or say what they've learned or whatever. And you're right, if an academic sort of even walks by that discussion board,
Exactly.
that's it, it's killed. And I discovered that by setting up a forum in my first year ever trying this, being away for 2 weeks in conference or junket or something, and coming back and, oh my God, the students had talked to each other. This is amazing. So I realized, yes, this is, so, some common strategies are, and this is Gilly Salmon's work. I don't know if you're familiar with Gilly Salmon, but she has a book called E-Moderation or something like that. She always calls them E-something. I think it's E-Moderation. And she suggests things like summarize and prompt. So for example, okay, we've got 3 ideas here for what we're talking about. What do other people think? Or something a bit harsher is, thanks very much, Tina and Chris, for your contribution, but George, you haven't said anything. Now, normally the person wouldn't be named. No, thanks very much to those who have contributed. What do other people think? And that means it's very clear to the students who haven't contributed that essentially you're aware that they haven't contributed. Now, of course, as class sizes increase, that becomes very difficult. But they're the 2 strategies that she sort of suggests. One thing I found was a postgrad who told me to do this was to allow anonymous posting. And because I wasn't grading, I didn't really care who was posting. The only reason I wanted non-anonymous posting was if anybody said anything mean, I could chase them up. But that wasn't an issue. And with anonymous posting, students are much more willing to contribute, because I find with students their biggest fear of contributing is they're afraid to be seen to be wrong, and especially with very high achieving students, they don't want to be seen to be wrong. So when I turned on anonymous posting, the postings went suddenly like boom. It just yeah. So I think there are some strategies, but it's not easy. I should say the discussion board I'm talking about here was very much if you have a problem, this is the place to come and ask. Didn't mean I always gave the answer. So for example, sometimes I would give a hint of an answer and say, okay, well, this is somewhere we go, and while you're there, why don't you think about this? So this idea of pushing it on one more level. Yeah.
When you enabled anonymous posting, does your system let them pick their own username or display name, or does it just show them as anon?
So we use Blackboard and it just comes up as anonymous.
Does that prevent back and forth dialogue from occurring? Like people would get mixed up as to who was replying to their post?
So one, I think it's Gilly Salmon also talks about having a rule for very clear discussion board titles. So in other words, if you reply to somebody, you must change the title to make the response, to make the title match your response. So that prevents if you're expecting a board where there's going to be lots of interaction, that prevents a system where you have, Tina is great, Tina is great, Tina is great. You have this kind of continuing updating of the title, and that helps a little bit with that. But I haven't yet had a busy discussion board where it's been anonymous, so I can't answer your question.
Just following on from that, the exact example that Lisa's talking. Just following on from that, the exact example that Lisa's talking about, we've had the experience where anonymous discussions has made no difference and actually been less effective than other units where we've had non-anonymous discussions. One of the issues we've got with Moodle is that they've got it the wrong way around. You set it to anonymous, everyone's anonymous unless they opt in. I'd kind of prefer it the other way around, where people, if they want to, can check that they're anonymous. The other thing about stimulating discussions is we've had a lot of success by setting challenge questions on the forums, and some of those have gone off where you've got like 70 or 80, literally 70 or 80 responses from students in terms of trying to work out the issues to these challenge questions, but also other similar strategies like you've mentioned already we've had success with.
Yeah, our system is you reply and you click a box to say anonymous, so it's opt.
Yeah, it's the other way.
Yeah.
If you set a forum, you have to click if you don't want to be anonymous. It just doesn't work very well.
Yes. I should say that pretty much all of our students choose to be anonymous if they're given the option. Yeah. Because this is a Q&A board where they don't want to be seen to be having to ask a question. In fact, it's this bizarre setup with bright students that they don't want to be seen to be needing help. It's sort of strange. I think one issue I found with discussion boards over time, and maybe this is just my general nature to overshare, is that in terms of creating a community, you want to, it wants to have some personality there. I can discuss that a little bit later. And I mentioned a summarising prompt, this idea of gathering together some main thoughts and then prompting some additional ideas or actions or whatever. That's also useful. What we're finding is our discussion board, which we run twice a year, it becomes like an FAQ. In other words, students go in and they had a question, but actually the question's already been answered. And if you have a couple of summarising prompt headers that are clear, that means it saves the whole process of having to ask a question and wait for the answer again. Okay, so this is just an example of lurking. So this is a board where there were 60 students, and you'll see not very many posts. So here we have 37 posts, most common there, 48. So 48 posts for one. So this is over 6 weeks for 60 students. You'll see at least half of those posts are mine because I'm responding. So the total participants is about half that number. Very small number of people actually participating. So I was looking at this, and I mean, I couldn't walk down the corridor but hear about how great discussion boards were. You know, my colleagues, senior professors in the department, where I hear discussion boards are going well. It's like, oh God, what do you know? What, you know? So this was something that was really catching on with students. But when you look at the access statistics, you see, okay, even though there's very few participants, you know, these boards had over 5,500 views over 6 weeks. Half the views for this one here, which had the total number of participants. This is obviously telling me that something is going wrong with this experiment. And then just at the end of the semester, this kicks on at semester 2 as well, running it for year 2 students. Again, very low number of posts, but a very high number of views. So for this kind of board, which is different to a peer-peer board that we were talking about earlier, this kind of board, very much Q&A, there's a lot of lurking going on. So, and I don't think that should be discounted in terms of the usefulness of discussion boards. Okay, so as I say, this was kind of a surprise because it was like a last-minute add-in, but this was just, you know, the School of Chemistry at the University of Edinburgh now knows all about discussion boards because it came up at every single student interaction meeting that we had. So much so that the school management committee decided to make this kind of universal policy. I was like, no. But again, I think this is about continuing this conversation, continuing this dialogue. I'm stuck, I have an issue, can you help me? And a lot of my pluses were have a think about this, and in the next lab, talk to your demonstrator about it. So trying to push it back, continue the conversation on back to a human. Okay, I'll just mention briefly the last topic, which is about video assessment. In general, the idea of formative assessment is something we're grappling with. And formative assessment has been described quite nicely by Sadler, who says that if you want genuine formative assessment, students should be able to consider and improve the quality of their work as they're producing it. In other words, producing something and submitting it and then getting feedback is not formative unless the student have the ability to redress that feedback and make it again, which is very often not the case. We usually have one assessment and then that's it. So even though you may have assessment as the year goes on, that may not be formative unless the student can have a chance to use it again. So we thought we'd pull it back and have bring on the option of students being able to improve their work as they're doing it so that they submit what they consider to be their best effort. So this aligns with Sadler's idea of formative assessment whereby the students have some idea of what is expected, what is the standard. They have the ability to compare what they're doing with the standard, and then they have the capacity to actually make some change before they submit their work. So we looked at this, and if you have access to this, which I'm sure you do, this is a wonderful book. David Carless is one of the editors. But Henry writes in this, he talks about this idea of universities loading up feedback, hanging on to what we know until after the deadline, and then telling students everything, rather than informing them and guiding them as they go along. And he argues for exemplars, presenting students with exemplar work and as guidance for this is what you should be aiming for, this is what good work looks like in this area. And then enabling students to try and meet that exemplar with guidance so that students will submit their work. And it's very clear in that case what the standard is. So we looked at this with students in laboratories, and we asked students to present a video of themselves completing a laboratory task. So they had to take a laboratory task, and if Tina and I were lab partners, she'd take my mobile phone and she'd video me on my mobile phone doing some laboratory task. And I would have watched the exemplar video in advance, so I would know what the standard was. So then I would have a video on my phone of me demonstrating some particular laboratory task. So I'd watch the exemplar materials in advance, I'd be videoed on my phone, and then I'd submit that video for assessment. And that assessment is very clear, is being marked against the exemplar criteria. So we had lots of videos made. These were the in-lab sheets, so we made these in-lab peer observation sheets. So this made it very clear what part you are meant to video. This is just to keep the videos a bit shorter than they might otherwise be. There was space here for peer feedback. In analysing these sheets, this tended to be, did it well, very good, pretty low level feedback. But with listening to the audio of the videos, there was a huge level of feedback going on. Oh, you were meant to do this, you were meant to say that, this was meant to be 2 decimal places. Lots of really rich feedback going on. So we didn't see much written feedback, but quite a lot of verbal feedback. And then students would submit their videos, and the great thing was now, rather than just, as we usually do in chemistry, assessing students on the quality of their results afterwards, we were able to say, this is where you went wrong. This is a specific issue where you went wrong when you were doing your titration. The other thing about this that we like is that it enables students to have a video of them being a chemist, doing something professional in their discipline that they can share as they will. One of the reasons we asked students to submit a link to the video, so they hosted it on YouTube or some university site, is that they then had control over that video. They had the option to delete it or share it or bring it onto intern applications or whatever. And we can discuss that a little bit more. This is all wrapped up in digital badges because students have now got a video of themselves. This process leads students to a video of themselves showing evidence of competency. And evidence of competency means we can now issue a badge that says students have achieved this competency. So we're going through a process where students will receive digital badges for various laboratory skills that they will be able to showcase. Because again, another problem in chemistry is we tend to assess laboratory work on laboratory reports, on the product of laboratories rather than on the process. So we can't say to students, you know what, you're really good at GC, here you go. All we can say is, yes, this student is good at analytical chemistry. We haven't got the data to really offer students insight on their particular capabilities. So you may have a student who's a real whiz in the lab, isn't very good at writing lab reports, so therefore their marks aren't going to reflect their labs. So this is an attempt to try and document students' competencies in laboratory work. Okay, so there's lots about badges. I'm obsessed with badges at the moment, but if you like badges, badginglabskills.wordpress.com is where we put everything badge related. So please do visit there and share any thoughts you have. Okay, so that is pretty much it. I think the main message for me is, as I pull this talk together, is this idea of empowering individuality. Very often technology is presented as this kind of thing that will feed the masses. We'll have 10 million students all learning online and everything will be amazing and it doesn't really matter that there's no interaction, whereas actually I think it's the opposite. We can really foster this kind of interaction through this sort of nascent idea of dialogue that I'm finding in my head, through this idea of continuing a dialogue back and forwards. This is what I think you should look at. I've looked at it. This is where I'm having difficulty. This is how you address those difficulties, and so on, right up until some assessment point. So that's really the message I wanted to get across. So I will leave you with this, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Michael. Wonderful as ever. Are there any questions or comments for Michael? Steve?
I wanted to ask about the video assessment.
Yeah.
In particular, who's marking all the reporting?
Yes, so I lost a week in October. Yeah. So we had 150 students, each producing 2 videos, so that was a long week. And the reason I did that was because when we roll it out to TAs next year, I wanted to be able to say to TAs, these are the 5 things you should be looking for in these videos. So I did that process partly because I was researching it and therefore I was interested in it selfishly, but also because it enables me to develop a really rich rubric for future assessment. So yeah, I definitely won't be marking again. It'll be TAs. Yeah.
Lincoln?
Were the badges linked to assessment?
Say that again.
Were the badges linked to assessment?
So yeah, so this is, I've had all sorts of sleepless nights about this because the major thing is somebody's going to come into my door one day and say, you're giving that student 60% for that lab, but you're also giving them a badge. You're giving them 2 awards for one thing. So the way it's worked is the student if the student makes a video and submits that video is graded and they'll get a lab mark. If the video passes muster, they also get a digital badge, but the lab mark is based on the demonstration of competency. The badge is essentially an acknowledgement of that competency.
Badges are really a shiny bauble rather than it actually being, you don't have to collect a certain number of badges to be able to pass or something.
No. Now, I don't know if I have it here, but what we are moving towards is this, which is effectively a kind of an iterative process of increasing complexity of badges. So students in year 1 will do all the kind of basic techniques. They'll need to show they have competency in them either by badges or some other means before they can progress into the year 2 levels. So for example, I asked students to come in a kind of a voluntary way. Second year students, I said, come in and earn a UV Viz badge during a midterm break, and about 15 did, which was 10% of the class, so that was respectable. And I asked them, why are you doing this? Why have you given up your free time? So they were interested in it because they liked the idea of doing something different in the lab. But we were just discussing it earlier. A really key message that came across was these students wanted a video of them doing something in chemistry that they could show to intern applications. So I think this idea of slightly career focused is a way of promoting it. But the question I can't answer yet is our badges just something shiny? You know, is it the underlying video part that students consider important? Or I think at the moment, you know, we're giving 2 badges to students in first year, and that's it. Of course, they're not really going to invest in it. But I think as we try and build and market this framework, it might become more useful to them.
I'm just wondering if you've done any comparative analysis of the academic results of your lurking learners online versus the ones who are more proactively engaged.
I can't because I've set it anonymous. So if you set the board to be anonymous, you're not. It genuinely is anonymous. Yeah, but that would be great. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what they found, but I think people have looked at that kind of thing. But I'm not. You know, so it tends to be the more engaged a student is, the better their mark is. But that would be clever to look at. Yeah.
Theo.
Do you enrol chemistry students, or do you enrol science students who then major in chemistry?
So yeah, we're very lucky. So we get 150 students in first year, and they're ours. Yeah. So they do a third of their modules in chemistry in first year, a third in maths, and then a third of what they want. In second year, they do a third chemistry, and then in third, fourth, and fifth year, they are 100% chemists. Yeah. So we have lots of service teaching courses as well, but we have 150.
But I've noticed that in talking to people in English universities about physics and stuff, it's quite, you suddenly realise you're having 2 different conversations, even though you think you're talking to each other, because I'm talking about having 400 students in first year, and we're desperately trying to keep them or convert them to physics students, because we don't have that many in third year. Whereas they're talking about having a bunch of students that they have for 3 years, and they're responsible for progress of those students.
Yeah.
It's quite a different conversation.
Absolutely, yeah, completely different motivations. I should say our chemists are co-taught with chemical engineers, and we do try and poach a few of those every year, but it's a completely different level of motivation because those people have opted to be there. Yeah. At the same time, on the counter view is, if you make it more interesting and you know, but I totally accept it's a different kettle of fish. Yeah.
Hey, quite like your phase space of engagement and effort. I'm wondering if you're familiar with platforms like Carousel, which seem to automate the assessment of contributors, and they highly value people who are in the high engagement, high effort quadrant. Your finding is that lurking's okay.
I'm not familiar what no. So my finding is lurking is okay. In this particular case, lurking is okay because I wasn't expecting interaction. In a previous case where it's fully online and interaction was a key part of building a community, so much so that I awarded it 10% by some vague scale, then lurking wasn't okay because I wanted interaction. So a lot of my work, a lot of my moderation work was pulling those people who I knew were on there into just saying something. So the balance is, do you make it anonymous and then know who said something, or you know? So yeah, it's quite complicated to manage that. So I think it comes down to what do you want the discussion board to be. For me, I wanted to be, in this case, I wanted it to be a continuation of conversation rather than necessarily fostering peer conversation, because these were students who were in class together every day anyway. Yeah.
Michelle.
Just to further this conversation, we moved to a different platform called Verso, which allows you as the educator to see the name of the person, but they're anonymous to each other. And it also stops the voyeurism, because I think, that's what I call it. Because I think there is evidence out there that actively engaging produces higher performance on at least knowledge-based outcomes. And what it does is it looks at other people's responses until you commit to a response. And it's incredibly helpful from the discussion board point of view, because I can see the answer to this question everybody's getting wrong around this topic.
Yeah.
So when I go into the classroom, because they haven't seen what other people are writing first, I know what I need to address, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's clever, yeah.
So I think sometimes voyeurism, not only it inhibits the learner, but it also inhibits the educator, because you don't get a sense of what the community
is having difficulty with. Yeah. Well, that's a fair
point. I don't know
point.
if that's been your, because you're seeing the lurking. I'm really interested that you have so much lurking. I would love to know if you evaluate.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the lurking is, I'm in week 1.
Yeah.
This conversation is going on about an experiment that I'll be doing in week 5. I'm not going to look at those conversations until I get to week 5. So I think a lot of the lurking is a new wave each week of people looking. In terms of, I use Blackboard and we're being recorded, so I will limit what I say about Blackboard. But we're, the issues with VLEs are, there's a million better solutions for the individual components of VLEs, but the great strength is it's one login. So I tend to avoid going external because it's just one extra thing that people are going to have to, But of course, I mean, there's another one where you can uprate questions, so if you have a very popular discussion board, you can have students a kind of Reddit style up.
It's a valid point, because uptake is one of our biggest struggles, because they now have another thing they have to sign on. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I wonder if there's anything you think we can learn from other successful online communities outside of education, private education, discussion.
I mean, I only through a postgraduate student learned about this website called Reddit about a month ago, which is apparently number 4, number 5 most popular website in the world. So it just goes to show you how you can be in a bubble. And the model there seems to be very much popularity based, and what's of interest, what's cool, what's hip. My worry is that if we chase those kind of models, that we're diminishing what we're trying to do, which is, I knew all the questions I was going to be asked in the discussion board. I could have just made an FAQ sheet, but I wanted to kind of foster a bit of dialogue, this idea of I'm asking a question and you care enough that you're going to answer. And my worry is that with those kind of popularity-based sites, that we're losing the shy person who really made an effort to, finally pick up the courage to go in there and post, but it's lurking somewhere down on page 22, well, 2. So I'd say that's something that, well, I'll not say we could learn from that, but that's something that I would say would be a health warning in terms of looking at the kind of very popular culture sites, because they're based on popularity, and we want to reach out to everybody, I guess. So I'm not sure, that doesn't really answer your question, but it's just kind of a long waffle to say I know what Reddit is.
I think it's more interesting, the idea of the community that's built. How do you build community online and in the educational space? What is it about those sites that draw people and make them feel like they belong to something personal and have that community interaction?
Yeah. I mean, one very powerful experience I had was with an online community of adult learners who were returning to work after the economic recession in Ireland, where a lot of people lost their jobs. So we had this special course that basically transformed them from workers in a pharmaceutical company to people who could make intelligent decisions about, an upskilling course effectively. And I had the pleasure of teaching them maths. So you can imagine, these are people who maybe had never done maths since school or even before, across a wide range of ages. So that's why I was talking, the issue about investing in personality, this issue of, from week 1, I was very keen that I didn't really care what maths they learned. Obviously I did, but I cared that they were approaching something that was going to be hugely challenging for them, and they were going to be able to use this as a story at the end of it. And I told them all this is, I want you to write down now what your concerns are about this, and we will come back to. So this kind of hopes, fears, expectation idea that Gilly Salmon also talks about. And that was enormously powerful. We had people writing very personal, I don't mean personalism, personal, but very intimate information in terms of their genuine fears, which okay, that was week 0. Weeks 1 to 6 were, I don't know what this equation means, blah blah blah, down to business. But it just that initial kind of prompt just fostered a real sense of, here's somebody who cares about me, here's somebody who's interested, here's somebody who's willing to share back. I think there's a lot around that in terms of just who are you as a person, rather than your number S21521 and you're going to get 42%. But that was with 25 students. With a very large number of students, that's very hard.
Marion. Okay, just a couple of things. I actually enrolled in a MOOC a couple of years ago just to see what it would be like to be part of one as a student. This was being run out of Caltech, and the discussions there, the discussion boards were huge, masses of people involved in discussing, but they were only active when those people were awake. So if you were outside the time zone, you post something, and by the time they woke up, you disappeared off the main screens. There was no responses at all. So that's something you have to be really aware of, that if you are online in the evenings, you'll get students conversing. But if you post something in the morning, forget it. But they also had a system which actually allowed upvoting of helpful responses. They had little ticks and likes and stuff like that. So if it was a particularly helpful or interesting topic, people could upvote it and it would stay hovering up near the top. But the thing that I was really interested in was with your videos. We've been getting our first years to do videos in second semester in Earth Atmospheric Environment. And I had 2 students walk out of the class because they didn't want to do a video. They were too scared to actually be on video. And they said they'd rather quit the class than do that. Did you find anything like that?
So I was very ready for this because when you try something new, you have to be aware of various cultural concerns and so on. So demonstrators got a really strong training message, which was, if somebody doesn't want to be videoed, that is absolutely fine. You watch them do the technique, you fill out the peer, you stand with the peer, you are effective with the camera, and everything's fine, because ultimately I want the student to demonstrate competency. As it turned out, nobody didn't want to be videoed, but that was a very clear message that if you don't want to be videoed, that's fine. You don't get the digital badge because you don't have digital evidence of competency, but you do get the marks for the lab. So there was no question that if somebody didn't want to partake in that process, and I think this comes back to the idea of universal design. We want a variety of assessments that suit a variety of learners, cultural, personal, and so on reasons. On the MOOC, I think the summarise and prompt issue is important there. I mean, obviously with a MOOC, and I guess with computational, computer science MOOCs, you're dealing with very large numbers of people enrolled. But the summarise and prompt from a teaching point of view with a normal class is very useful, because even with a moderately busy discussion board, if you check in on Monday and then come back on Thursday and there's 20 posts, you're not going to read them all. So I think the idea of changing subject titles, summarising prompts, do allow for that kind of easier navigation.
Very last question, Luke.
So I have this appealing vision of students marching around in Edinburgh with a rack of medals on them.
There is a guy in Australia, and I won't say his name, who has made physical badges, and I am so jealous. He's going to send me some. I really, yeah.
So how are your badges actually delivered online? And
yeah, so this is another quirk. So in Blackboard, because Blackboard is Blackboard, great system. But they don't call them badges; they call them achievements. So there's a trigger. So basically, students submit the video. I check it, enter a mark that will prompt the trigger, and then the student gets the badge within Blackboard, within the achievements area. Because of data protection issues, they have to press a button themselves, which will then push it out to some open badges backpack where they can share it to the wider world. And I have no idea how many do that, because I'm not allowed to know.
So sounds like it's fully supported within your LNS.
No, because Blackboard, Mozilla, who support the open badges TAC stopped supporting it and is now supported by the Open Badges Foundation, which meant that the link between Blackboard and Open Badges broke in December, thankfully, just after we were doing everything. And I've been reassured that they're resetting that link, but that is an issue, yeah. If you use Moodle, it's much easier. Moodle is much more streamlined, yeah.
Okay, I think the quality and the quantity of discussion that we've just had really indicates what a really great presentation that we've just had. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming to Monash this afternoon and sharing that with us. Great talk, lots for us to think about and talk about. So will you join me in thanking Michael?
Thank you very much.